Have you ever built a life so meticulously, piece by piece, that you mistake the blueprint for your soul? We construct these identities with such care, laying each brick of achievement, each mortar of ambition, until the structure stands tall and gleaming, a testament to our control. But what happens when the architect of that world becomes its first ruin? What happens when you realize the foundation was never stone, but sand? It's a strange thing, silence. A forgotten country. We spend our lives running from it, fleeing its vast, empty landscapes. We fill the space with noise, with deadlines, with the frantic hum of productivity, with the chatter of validation. We build towers of achievement, stacking them higher and higher, hoping their altitude will protect us from the quiet, resonant truth waiting patiently on the ground below. My tower was made of glass and steel, a monument of clean lines and cold precision, piercing the skyline of a city that worshipped such things. I was an architect. It was more than a profession, it was the very grammar of my being. I didn't just design buildings, I designed my own existence, curating every experience, every relationship, with the same exacting eye I brought to a floor plan. And Julian, he was my co-architect, or so I believed. Our journey began not in a boardroom, but in the chaotic, sleep-deprived halls of graduate school, under the unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights at 3 a.m. I remember one night specifically, a haze of caffeine and desperation, wrestling with a design for a community library. I was stuck, trapped in a cage of conventional thinking. He found me slumped over my drafting table, surrounded by crumpled sketches. He didn't say a word. He just pulled up a stool, picked up a fresh sheet of trace paper, and began to sketch alongside me. He wasn't correcting my work, he was conversing with it. His lines responded to mine, creating a dialogue on the page. Where I saw a wall, he saw a permeable screen. Where I saw a barrier, he saw a threshold. We spoke a language others couldn't understand, a shorthand of load-bearing walls and cantilevered dreams. Our minds moved in tandem, a perfect, unspoken dance of form and function. He was the voice, the charismatic frontman who could sell a dream to a room of skeptics. I was the soul, the quiet engine that gave the dream its depth and integrity. Our firm, Vance and Thorne, wasn't just a business. It was a living, breathing entity born from those late nights, from shared dreams whispered over coffee-stained blueprints, from the quiet thrill of seeing a line on paper rise into the world as a tangible thing. For 10 years, we built. We started in a cramped studio with peeling paint and a radiator that clanged like a blacksmith's hammer. We built a reputation for work that wasn't just innovative, but soulful. We believed buildings should breathe. We believed light was a material just as important as concrete. And our masterpiece, the culmination of everything we were, was the Helios project. It was more than a residential tower. It was my heart rendered in steel and sunlight. I had dreamt of it for years. A structure designed to not just catch the sun, but to converse with it. I designed a central atrium, a solar lung that would draw light deep into the building's core, shifting its patterns throughout the day so that the inhabitants would feel connected to the sky, even on the 40th floor. I designed a facade of articulated panels that would shift minutely with the temperature, allowing the building to breathe with the city, a subtle, organic response to its environment. It was my poetry, my philosophy, written in a language of structure and space. It was the best of me. It was the best of us. The betrayal, when it came, wasn't a loud explosion. There was no shouting match, no dramatic confrontation. It was quiet. Utterly, devastatingly quiet. It arrived as a whisper in the glossy pages of Metropolis, the industry's Bible. I saw it on a Tuesday morning, the sunlight streaming into our office, the very light I had learned to worship and manipulate. The Helios project, unveiled in a sprawling 10-page feature. His project. A triumph of Julian Vance's visionary genius. I scanned the pages, my breath catching in my throat. My name was nowhere. Not in the credits, not in the footnotes, not even as a passing mention. It was a complete erasure. I had been rendered a ghost, a phantom who had merely haunted the drafting table while the master worked his magic. The solar lung was his stroke of brilliance. The breathing facade was his unprecedented innovation. He had taken my poetry and signed his name to it. My hands trembled as I dialed his number. He was in London, accepting a preliminary award. He answered on the second ring, his voice buoyant, full of the static of international success. "Julian," I managed, my voice a thin, brittle thing I didn't recognize. "The Metropolis article." "TA." Air was a pause, not a pause of surprise, but of calculation. the sound of a carefully prepared script being mentally accessed. "Ah, yes. Incredible, isn't it?" he said, his tone smooth, polished, a surface with no handholds for my desperation. "Elara, we had to streamline the narrative. The investors, the brand, it's stronger with a singular vision, a singular voice. It's just business. You of all people should understand that." Business? The word hung in the air between us, a sterile, brutal finality. He had taken the most intimate part of my soul, the work that had flowed from the deepest part of me, and called it an asset to be leveraged. He took our shared history, our decade of collaborative dreaming, and rebranded it as his narrative. The line went quiet, but he hadn't hung up. He was waiting. Waiting for me to be the professional, to say, "I understand," to swallow the shards of my own heart and agree that it was, indeed, for the best. I said nothing. I just ended the call, the silence on my end a scream he would never hear. For weeks, my world shrank to the size of my own torment. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. I went to the office, my body moving on autopilot. The space that was once a sanctuary of creativity became a stage for my humiliation. I could feel the gazes of our team, a mixture of pity, confusion, and awkward avoidance. Whispers ceased when I entered a room. Young interns who once looked at me with admiration now couldn't meet my eye. I had become a cautionary tale, the ghost in the machine. My mind, once a place of elegant structure and creative flow, became a storm. A relentless hurricane of fury, of replaying every conversation from the last year, searching for the crack in the foundation I had so blindly missed. There were signs I saw now. The way he started talking about my vision in meetings. The way he took credit for a small detail I'd sketched on a napkin. The way he grew more interested in the awards, the galas, the interviews, while I remained lost in the work itself. I had mistaken his ambition for our shared passion. I drafted lawsuits in my head, eloquent and damning. I wrote scathing emails, masterpieces of controlled rage that I never sent. I walked the streets of the city we had claimed to love, and every building felt like an accusation. The skyline we had helped to shape now mocked me, a monument to my own invisibility. I wanted to tear down his world, brick by stolen brick. I wanted him to stand in the rubble and feel the cold, hollowing emptiness of a space where something beautiful used to be. But this burning, this all-consuming rage, it was a fire that was only consuming me. He was out there, celebrating, shaking hands, his name becoming synonymous with genius, while I was trapped in the inferno of my own mind, my own apartment. A space I had designed for peace and clarity, now a prison cell. The breaking point, the moment of true surrender, came on a rainy November night. I was scrolling through an architecture blog, a masochistic ritual I couldn't stop, and I saw a photo. It was from the awards gala in London. Julian was at the podium holding the gleaming trophy for Building of the Year. The Helios Project's trophy. Our trophy. His smile was radiant. And standing beside him, her hand proprietarily on his arm, was the lead journalist from Metropolis who had written the article. They were laughing. The world was celebrating him for stealing my life, and he was celebrating with the very person who had helped him do it. Something inside me didn't just break, it dissolved. The warrior, the fighter, the architect of vengeance simply laid down her weapons. The fire didn't just die, it turned to ash. I looked around my perfect, minimalist apartment at the carefully chosen art, the custom furniture, the view of the city lights blurred by rain, and I felt nothing but a profound sense of alienation. This wasn't my life. It was a set I had built for a character I no longer wanted to play. And in that utter defeat, in that hollowing out, a new voice emerged. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was barely a whisper, coming from the deep, quiet country I had been running from my whole life. It asked a simple, terrifying question. What if you stopped fighting and just left? What if you walked away from the entire battlefield? So I did. Before the sun rose, I packed a single bag. I didn't take the awards from our firm's early days, or the designer clothes, or the laptop filled with unrealized projects. I packed 3 worn paperbacks, a sketchbook with yellowing pages, a fountain pen, and a thick wool sweater. Things that connected to my core self, not my professional persona. I wrote a 1-line resignation email to the firm's general account and left my key on the polished concrete counter. I walked out of the building, into the pre-dawn quiet of the city, and didn't look back. I drove until the skyscrapers dissolved into the gray mist of the suburbs, and the suburbs melted into farmland, and the farmland rose into forested hills. I drove without a destination, escaping the grid lines of the map I had once helped to draw, until the symphony of traffic became the simple, steady rhythm of the wind. I found it by accident, a dirt road I took on a whim, a hand-painted sign that just said lake. At the end of it was a small cabin, a forgotten little structure nestled in a grove of ancient pines, its wood weathered to a soft silver gray. It was slowly being reclaimed by nature, moss creeping up its foundation, vines tracing the lines of the window frames. It was imperfect. It was quiet. It was the antithesis of everything I had ever built. It was exactly what I needed. The first week, the silence was a physical presence. It was not peaceful, it was deafening. It was a vacuum that amplified the raging storm in my head. With no meetings to run to, no deadlines to chase, no noise to distract me, there was nowhere to hide from the relentless loop of my thoughts. The ego, my fierce, wounded ego, screamed for justice. It showed me high-definition images of Julian's success, of my failure, of their laughing faces. It was a cruel and constant tormentor. One night, I was woken by the phantom sound of a phone ringing. I sat bolt upright in the dark, my heart pounding, my hand reaching for a device that wasn't there, convinced it was a late-night call from the office with an emergency only I could solve. The silence that rushed back in was more terrifying than the dream. It was the sound of my own obsolescence. I tried to sketch, but my hands, once so steady and precise, could only produce angry, jagged lines, a seismograph of my inner earthquake. The second week, the storm began to lose some of its intensity, not through force, but through sheer exhaustion. The rage subsided into a dull, heavy ache of grief. I wept. I wept for the lost years, for the lost friendship, for the lost belief in a shared dream. I wept until I was empty, a hollowed-out vessel washed up on the shore of my own life. It was during this time that I ran out of the few supplies I'd brought. The forced necessity of a trip to the nearest town felt like a monumental effort. The small general store was a relic from another era, with creaking wooden floors and the scent of sawdust and coffee. An old man with kind, crinkled eyes behind the counter nodded as I gathered my items: bread, cheese, a can of beans. "Just passing through?" he asked, his voice gentle, not prying. I mumbled something about needing some quiet. He just smiled. "This is a good place for it," he said. "The lake, she has a way of sorting things out. You just have to be quiet enough to listen." That simple, unburdened human interaction, free of pity or expectation, was the first crack of light in my self-imposed darkness. It was in that emptiness that something else began to seep in. I started a small, tentative ritual. Every morning, just as the mist was lifting off the lake, I would walk to the water's edge barefoot. The cold, damp earth was a shock to my system, a grounding force. I wouldn't try to meditate or think peaceful thoughts. I would just stand there and notice. I noticed the sharp, clean scent of pine. I noticed the intricate, fractal patterns of frost on a fallen leaf. I noticed the sound of a single loon calling out across the water, its cry echoing in the vast stillness. I began to remember one specific afternoon during the Helios construction. I was on the 40th floor, just an open slab of concrete at the time, arguing with the engineers about the glazing for the solar lung. They said my design was too complex, too expensive. Julian was in a meeting with investors. I stood there alone, the wind whipping around me, holding a small piece of iridescent glass I'd sourced, showing them how it fractured the afternoon light into a spectrum of colors. I won that argument, not with force, but with the sheer passion for the idea. The memory, once a source of pride, now burned with the acid of betrayal. But here, by the lake, I started to see it differently. The passion was mine. The victory was mine. The light was real. Those things could not be stolen. I started to see that my mind was not the only reality. There was this other world, this quiet, breathing, living world that had been here all along, indifferent to my personal drama. It didn't care about my stolen legacy. The ancient trees, their bark like the skin of elephants, didn't judge my anger. The lake, its surface a mirror for the sky, didn't ask for my credentials. They just were. And in their silent, powerful presence, my own story began to feel smaller. Less like the center of the universe, and more like a single, tightly wound knot in an infinitely larger tapestry. I invite you to try this just for a moment. Close your eyes. Take a breath. Not a shallow, anxious one from the top of your chest, but a deep, grounding breath that travels all the way down to your core, to TH. Earth beneath you. Feel it fill you. And as you exhale, let it go completely. Now just notice the space between your thoughts. There's a moment of stillness there, isn't there? A quiet clearing in the dense forest of your mind. It might only last a second, but it's there. Can you feel it? That is the beginning of peace. That is the country I was beginning to explore. I began to find that clearing more often. I started to see my thoughts not as me, but as phenomena, like weather patterns passing through the vast, unchanging sky of my awareness. The anger, the grief, the shame, they were powerful storms. They could block out the sun and shake the very foundations, but they were not the sky. The sky remains before, during, and after the storm. I was not the storm. I was the sky. This realization was a quiet revolution. My hands, which had been idle and useless, started to feel an itch to create again. Not to design, not to plan, not to build something for a client or a portfolio or for Julian to see, but simply to make. I started walking the shoreline, collecting pieces of driftwood. Each one was a sculpture in itself, its shape twisted and smoothed by years of wrestling with the water and the rocks. They were broken, yes, but they were also beautiful. They held stories. The grain of the wood felt like a language under my fingertips. I learned to read the history in each piece, the smooth, silvered surface where it met the water, the rough, darker core where it had broken from its source. I brought them back to the cabin and laid them out on the porch. For days, I just looked at them. Then, one afternoon, I picked up two pieces and saw how they fit together. There was no blueprint, no grand design. I just followed the lines of the wood, the story it seemed to want to tell. It was an intuitive process, a conversation between my hands and the material. In my old life, I imposed my will upon concrete and steel. Here, I was listening to the wood, surrendering to its form, collaborating with its history. I was building again, but this time I was building from a place of listening, not a place of dictating. Weeks turned into a season. The fierce green of summer softened into the gold and crimson of autumn. The sculpture on my porch grew, an organic, sprawling form that looked like the bleached skeleton of some mythical creature or the roots of an ancient tree. It was strange and beautiful and utterly my own. One day, a piece I found didn't fit. It was a gnarled, heavy knot of wood, stubborn and unyielding. It disrupted the flow of the entire piece. My first instinct, the old architect's instinct, was to discard it. But the new voice, the quieter one, urged me to wait. I sat with it for days. I didn't try to force it. I just observed it. And I realized the sculpture wasn't meant to be perfectly harmonious. It was meant to be true. The knot was part of the story. It was the grief, the anger, the unbreakable core of the pain. I found a place for it, not by hiding it, but by making it the center, the anchor from which the more graceful pieces could extend. One crisp October afternoon, my phone, which had been silent for months, buzzed. It was a text from an old friend from school, a kind soul named Maria. "Ilara, I know you've gone off-grid, but I had to share this. Did you see? The Helios project just won the International Zenith Prize, the biggest one of all. I know how much of you is in that building. I hope you're celebrating." Her words were meant with love, but they landed like a stone. I felt it, the old reflex. A wave of heat rising in my chest, a familiar tightening in my jaw. The storm on the horizon, threatening to roll back in. I saw his face, smiling at another podium, accepting another award built on my erasure. The ego, that old ghost, whispered in my ear, "See? He wins. He keeps winning. And you are here with a pile of dead wood." But then something different happened. I didn't fight the feeling. I didn't push it away. I just watched it, like a cloud moving across the sky of my awareness. I took a deep breath. I looked down at my hands, covered in the fine, pale dust of driftwood and the rich scent of lake water and earth. I looked at the sculpture in front of me, this tangible thing born of silence and patience. And then I thought of Julian, in his sharp suit, under the hot glare of stage lights, in a room full of applause that would only ever feed a hunger that could never be filled. And the feeling that washed over me was not anger. It was not sadness. It was a quiet, astonishing wave of pity, a profound sense of compassion for the prison he had built for himself. A world where worth was external, where validation was the only currency, where he would have to keep building taller and taller towers to outrun his own inner silence. His world, I realized with a clarity that felt like the cold, clean lake water, was his world. It was a frantic, noisy place, and it no longer had any power over mine. I texted Maria back. "That's wonderful news for him, and yes, I am celebrating. Thank you for thinking of me." I placed the last piece of driftwood onto the sculpture. It was a slender, curved piece that looked like a wing. The entire structure was a paradox. It was grounded and heavy, yet it seemed to be taking flight. It was an architecture of surrender, a monument to letting go. That evening, I took the old sketchbook from my bag, the one with the yellowing pages. I flipped past the angry, jagged lines I had drawn in my first week. At the back, on a clean page, I drew the sculpture. Not as a technical drawing, but as an impression, capturing its spirit, its brokenness, its beauty. Then I closed the book, walked to the small, crackling fire I'd built in the hearth, and I laid the sketchbook upon the flames. I watched as 10 years of plans, ambitions, and finally, the record of my own healing, curled into ash and smoke, rising into the vast, silent night sky. It wasn't an act of destruction. It was an act of release. He had built a tower of glass and steel to reflect his own ego. He thought strength was in sharp lines, in control, in a singular, loud narrative. But I had learned something different here, in the quiet company of the trees and the water. I had learned to build with the broken pieces. I had learned to build with silence. I discovered that true strength isn't in building walls to keep the world out, or in fighting every battle. It's in becoming a space so vast, so open, that it can hold everything without breaking. The pain, the joy, the storm, the calm. I didn't need to tear his world down. The thought itself now seemed small, pointless. I just needed to build my own. And this time, the foundation was not ambition or recognition. It was the quiet, unshakable earth beneath my feet. As I looked at the little cabin, no longer a temporary shelter but the beginnings of a home, I realized I hadn't just been building a sculpture. I had been drafting a new blueprint. A blueprint for a life measured not in square feet or accolades, but in the depth of its silence and the authenticity of its construction. The quietest places hold the loudest truths.